So Prime Minister Julia Gillard has long declared education her biggest political priority. Yet spending on education as a proportion of GDP in Australia currently sits at 3.1%, which is half the OECD average of 6.2%. But what's even more sickening about this is that 75% of federal funding goes to non-government schools. Even the fairly moderate Gonski review recommends an injection of $3.8 billion into critically underfunded government schools. Your average government school gets, which receives no school fees from parents, gets $3,000 less per student than your average private school. There is a pronounced correlation between academic achievement and class. 90% of the most disadvantaged students have a reading level below the average at grade 3, and that gap just continues to grow and grow by the time they reach their senior years at high school. And if you look at the top VCE scoring schools, you will find only 5 non-government schools out of that top 50. And 4 of those government schools are selective entry schools. And most selective entry schools, their cohorts come from a higher socioeconomic background anyway. While Geelong Grammar boasts that 250 of their students can bring their horse to school as part of campus life, thanks to their indoor equestrian centre, a third of Victorian government schools need urgent repairs. But has any of this actually meant that the government has keenly taken up the recommendations of the Gonski Review? No, it hasn't. Instead, the dire state of education has been blamed on teachers and the unions that support them, with hideous proposals like the divide and rule tactic of performance pay and the sacking of the lowest performing teachers being part of the mainstream discourse around public education, thanks to both the Labor and Liberal Party alike. So this begs the question, why is public education so undervalued, and then what is the role of education under capitalism? So specifically today, I'm going to be looking at working class schooling. Jane was going to look at ruling class schooling, but we're going to miss that today. We're going to focus primarily on the function of working class schooling. So I'll look at this now. The conventional idea is that education is a social leveller in our society. So this is a quote from Horace Mann, one of the educational reformers in the United States in the 1800s. And he says, education then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is the great equaliser of the conditions of men, the balance wheel of social machinery. So I think this idea still exists today, if not, at least as a hope, if not an expectation. But the fact is that the largest determining factor of economic success is not education, but parental income. And you don't need to take my word for it, the OECD actually states this fact. So how does this idea then gain any resonance at all? Because there is actually a grain of truth to the idea that education can increase an individual's economic advantage. Of the people born in the poorest quintile, so that's the poorest 20%, 6% of those make it to the richest quintile, so the richest 20%. And education is the most common means by which these people rise up the social ladder. And I've got a graph here, and it shows you so there's 5 quintiles, because 5 20s make 100. And I do teach maths sometimes. So that's the bottom quintile, the poorest 20%, all the way up to the richest. And that's the birth, what economic status people are born into. And on this axis, you've got what they become as an adult. So as you can see, 43% of those born in the bottom quintile stay there. And in my talk, I've got 6% as a figure. That's from the OECD, but this graph shows that it's about 4% that get up to the highest quintile. And those born at the top of society, 40% of them stay there. And it just shows you the movement between socioeconomic class. But this movement, the movement between social classes that education offers, is happens less nowadays than, say, the 70s, because clearly the relative advantage enjoyed by those with a tertiary degree has fallen over time, with that being much more commonplace, accessibility to tertiary education. And there's a nice analogy that education theorist John Marsh uses. He says if one person stands up in a crowded movie theatre, they'll be able to see the screen better, but if everybody stands up, we'd be back to where we started, and only the taller people would have an advantage. So as more and more people are getting more and more skilled and more educated, the entry requirements for certain jobs, they're getting more and more to keep up with that, to keep people out and sort them into who can get into what job. But the social mobility that education promises is also quite limited. It's only limited to a rearranging of the relative advantage that is available to the working class. So clearly the Gina Rineharts of the world, they don't reach their filthy rich status by studying, having billionaire parents 101. So, your education is not a ticket into the 1%, the most rich. And while educational qualifications may be the best insurance against unemployment, this is only the case if the economy actually has jobs to offer. So in 2011, there was an exception to this out of the EU member states. Does anyone want to guess what that exception was? Come on. Greece, obviously, devastated by the GFC. They found there that being more educated didn't mean that you were more likely to get a job. In fact, in Greece, the youth unemployment rate is 55%, so half the college graduates who are looking for jobs aren't able to find one. And the United States, similarly, the rate of unemployment in college graduates there is 53%. And so I think here the take-home message is that, in a time of economic crisis, capitalism doesn't really care how educated you are. So I've tried to debunk the myth that the role of education is to provide an equal chance to achieve economic success and stability. But now I'm going to look at the work of two Marxist economists, Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis, to try and explain what the real role of education under capitalism is for working class youth. Bowles and Gintis were among the first to present a systematic analysis of education under capitalism, which challenged the dominant ideology that education is an avenue out of poverty with their seminal book, Schooling in Capitalist America. Has anyone actually read this book? Yep, so a few people. They argued that schools simultaneously benefit both the ruling class and the working class in contradictory ways. They put it like this. Since the mid-19th century, the dual objectives of educational reformers, equality of opportunity and social control, have been intermingled, the merger of these two threads sometimes so nearly complete that it becomes impossible to distinguish between the two. Schooling has been at once something done for the poor and to the poor. So schools play a particular role in reproducing the next layer of workers. There are many elements involved in this. One component is practical. Capitalist exploitation requires that workers have basic literacy and numeracy skills, but the extent to which you learn job-specific skills at school is really limited. Mostly you learn on the job. Another practical purpose of education, particularly today when there's a lot more access to it, is as a sorting ground. So standardised testing like NAPLAN and in Victoria the VCE truly reveals how schools are overwhelmingly geared towards ranking students to sort them into various courses and institutions. Schools also serve the purpose of preparing youth for economic life, and this idea is not controversial on the left. And I'm going to explain this preparation process for economic life in the workforce by briefly looking at the idea of the hidden curriculum and then at the correspondence theory. So as Bowles and Gintis found, the reasons why most larger employers supported public education are apparently related to the non-cognitive effects of schooling, what they called the hidden curriculum. And basically the hidden curriculum describes the implicit ways in which knowledge and behaviour are constructed outside of the course materials and usual lessons. An important part of this is the shaping and selection of personality traits. There's been a number of studies that have been done looking at the linking of favourable personality traits and success at school. And these findings show quite an interesting trend. One of these studies looked at the grade point average. So the grade point average is the GPA. It's a number that represents an average of a student's grades across their time at school. In America, it's an American thing. And the GPA found that traits that were associated with good workers were most favoured by the GPA. So getting a good GPA score was closely related to getting showing these personality traits. These traits included dependability, perseverance, consistency, willingness to follow orders, punctuality, and my favourite, an ability to delay gratification. And you can see them up here. So they're the traits there. They're positively, they're rewarded by the GPA. The ones that were penalised by the GPA were creativity, aggressiveness, and independence. So you probably don't want aggressive employees. They might turn out to be, militant unionists one day. But this is contrary to, the hidden curriculum denies supposed educational ideals and goals. Because if you listen to dominant educational rhetoric, you'd think that creativity and independence are things that we want our students to be doing. But sinister, they don't actually want that. I'm going to move on to the correspondence theory, but I want to look at this thing. I don't know if anyone's seen this before. It's made the rounds on Facebook, and it's apparently meant to be Bill Gates, his 11 rules that you don't get to learn at school. It's not actually Bill Gates who came up with this. People think it is, but it's not. And a lot of my teacher friends post this on Facebook and, think that, because at the bottom it's been cut off, but it says, if you agree, pass it on. If you can read this, thank a teacher. But some of the person who's actually responsible for these 11 rules is a right-wing education author whose name is Charles J. Sykes. And he makes the case that schools don't do enough to prepare students for the workplace. Some of his highlights up here include, well, the first one is, life is not fair, get used to it. Another highlight, if you think your teacher is tough, wait until you get a boss. And then he's got, life is not divided into semesters. You don't get summers off, and very few employers are interested in helping you find yourself. Do that in your own time. And right at the bottom it says, be nice to nerds. Chances are you'll end up working for one. So that's why it's been accredited to Bill Gates, because he's supposedly a nerd, and that's why he's so rich. So here, like I said, he's making the argument that schools aren't tough enough on students to prepare them for the harsh realities of the workforce. And here you can really see the ruling class idea of what the purpose of schools is. It's clearly spelled out here. Sometimes, though, it can be more disguised than these 11 rules. But there's no doubt that schools have historically served the function of behaviour control. This was articulated by a US school committee as early as 1854 when they wrote, "The object of education is by no means accomplished by mere intellectual instruction. It has other aims of equal, if not higher, importance, the character and habits that are to be formed for life." And Horace Mann, the initial picture I showed you, the guy who came up with the phrase, the great equalizer, he argued that the citizen of tomorrow will think of duty rather than of the policeman. So he was making the case that schools, rather than instilling obedience, should be promoting self-control from the students. So the goal here is to effect the internalisation of behaviour norms that bosses and managers find desirable in workers. The values and behaviours rewarded and reinforced in schools provide bosses with workers who have what Bowles and Gintis refer to as a built-in supervisor. And prevailing ideology around schools tries to hide the class divisions that actually exist under capitalism. The so-called self-directed worker is trained to think that salary, prestige, and success at work depend on intellectual capabilities and work ethic rather than, rather than actually being born to rich parents, because they would argue, after all, we all had an equal chance to get an education, so it's your fault what you make of it. If you're not successful, it's your own fault. You wasted time at school, didn't study hard enough, that sort of thing. And part of that self-direction is maintained with a reward system, anything from praise to good grades to entrance to better courses. And there's a whole area of psychology as well that's devoted to developing management techniques for both classroom and the workplace which build on this principle. Bowles and Gintis analysed this preparatory role with what they call the correspondence theory. And before I try and flesh out what the correspondence theory is, I'm going to look at a quote from Bowles and Gintis about what it is. They say it is the educational system helps integrate youth into the economic system, we believe, through a structural correspondence between its social relations and those of production. The structure of social relations in education not only inures the student to the discipline of the workplace, but develops the types of personal demeanour, modes of self-presentation, self-image, and social class identifications, which are the crucial ingredients of job adequacy. Specifically, the social relationships of education, the relationships between administrators and teachers, teachers and students, students and students, and students and their work replicate the hierarchical divisions of labour. So, correspondence theory argues that the hierarchical structure in schools are mirrored also in the workplace, and also the relationships between people in schools as well mirrored in the workplace. And I'm going to try and provide a few examples of how this is the case. Something as simple as uniform. So at school, you need to wear a school uniform, and I think in the workplace, even if you don't have a work uniform, most of us do have to, there's some sort of dress code that you have to follow. You can't just wear whatever you want to work. At both work and school, you're kept to a strict regimen. You can't choose your lunchtime. At school, it's all directed by the bell, the timetable. Work is kind of similar as well. You can't choose your own toilet breaks. At both situations, you've got limited movement. So you're expected to stay at your own desk or in your own classroom or in your own office, at your own work site. And social interaction is also quite limited because if you're talking to your peers, then that's considered wasting time. There's also a regime of rewards for hard workers, so things like Employee of the Month or Student of the Week. And there's always an incentive because you don't just learn for the benefit of gaining knowledge, and you don't just work for the benefit of contributing to society. You work because you need a paycheck, you need money to feed yourself and pay your bills, and you go to school because you need to get those grades to get into that course to eventually get that job. There's a lack of democracy and intellectual control over our studies, much like the lack of control that workers have. Workers don't have any control over what they produce, for who and how, and we're alienated from both, from what we do both at school and at work. Both of these places promote competition as well. In school, you need to compete with your fellow students because you might need to compete for grades or compete for limited places in certain areas, limited spots in the accelerated class or limited spots in that university degree. It's all about competition and who's going to do better than who, and you have to step over each other to do that. Work is a bit like that too. If you're looking for a job, you have to compete to find those jobs, through the job interviews. And once you've got a job, you need to compete for promotions. Or if you're on a contract, you need to compete to stay at that job. And returning back to these 11 rules, these ideas are actually quite entrenched, not just entrenched with teachers as well. And I think and beyond teachers as well, I think students can believe these things in broader society. But I think the experience of being a teacher under capitalism can lend itself to actually agreeing with this sort of stuff. So when you're teaching so-called nerds and rebels, an already stressed out teacher who's just trying to do their job, just trying to teach, can find it quite difficult to deal with a disruptive student. So just like, a waiter who's just trying to do their job and they've got an annoying customer, a disruptive customer, I think it's a bit like that. It's analogous to that. You've got this annoying student, you're trying to teach a class and they keep asking you questions and questioning you, and therefore you can feel more positively towards a nerd, what we call a nerd, who's just doing all the work and is quiet and whatever you tell them they just do it. That you can feel more positively towards that. And it's not uncommon to go into a teacher's staff room and hear a lot of teachers talking about those horrible students in their class who ruin their day. That's another added pressure on teachers that can lead them to believe this sort of stuff. But the role of schooling is not just to hide the social divisions, but it's also to reinforce them, to reproduce them. Bowles and Gintis maintain that the primary focus of education is to reproduce inequality. The nature of education that students from different class backgrounds get access to is a key factor in this. And when I talk about the nature of education, I'm not talking about the quality of education because, the teachers in private schools, they've got the same qualifications, they went to the same institutions, got the same degrees. And the body of evidence coming out the Gonski Review also shows that teaching standards are not different in private schools when compared with public schools. Where in working class schools, though, students are being prepared for their role in the workplace, one of subservience and, ideally for the bosses, one of compliance, elite private schools teach students to rule. So there's a difference in the nature of education you get in that sense. And the difference between the ends to which education is geared for students of different class backgrounds has been identified by various studies, and I'm going to look at one such study, which is Jean Agnon's Social Class and the Hidden Curriculum. She looked at 4 different kinds of schools: working class, middle class, affluent, professional, and executive elite. The working class schools, she found, had an emphasis on obedience and rote learning. The middle class was found to emphasise getting the right answer and following directions, and she concluded possibly preparing these kids for middle management. And affluent schools, by contrast, promoted student-led, creative, independent learning. And with the executive elite schools, she found them to be rigorous and inquiry-based, but with more of a sense that there are right and wrong answers, and she concluded that the children here were being prepared to be powerful leaders. And although it's true that more people do have access to education than ever before, there is still a section of society that does not get any access to higher education at all. In fact, the representation of low socioeconomic status students in higher education in Australia has remained at about 15% for the last 15 years. And of that 15%, there's a division as to which tertiary institutions they go to. So a school or an institution like Victoria University, whose most campuses are in the western suburbs, in working class suburbs of Melbourne, used to be a technical school, that its enrolment is 25% from low SES. And if you compare it to this elite sandstone university, Melbourne University, there's only have 7% from low socioeconomic status. And if you come here, that wouldn't be a surprise to you. Now I'm going to move on to what education is actually like under capitalism. It's a well-known cliche that schools kill creativity. So I'm going to look at some concrete examples. I'm going to start with a quote from a participant in the student movement of Paris 68. This student says, "We are preoccupied with curricula. We cram, we bluff, and we learn more for the sake of the exam than to form our personalities. We are judged on bookish knowledge hastily stocked, and that one quickly forgets as soon as the exam is finished. The exam privileges competition, emulation for social success, and reinforces individualistic mental habits." And it's true, schools are dominated by examinations and tests. At the risk of being a bit Victoria-centric, we've got NAPLAN, although NAPLAN is Australia-wide, but we've also got SACS, which is school-assessed coursework. We've got BCE exams, and in between these high-stakes tests, we have topic tests, quizzes, etc., etc. Just goes on and on, test after test after test. And this accountability through constant testing in practice, prescribes a pedagogical style in which students are constantly asked to passively regurgitate what they've been taught, which it really is what they've been told. Any practical use of, or exploration or interrogation of curriculum content detracts from important time that could be spent on cramming for standardized tests. And again, it's not uncommon to, when a student asks a question in a classroom, for the teacher to say, well, that's not going to be on the test, so you don't have to worry about that. So really crushing the inquisitive nature of children. And by the time they're, senior, they don't ask any questions anymore. At the same time, though, the logic of individualism that this fosters discourages learning in a collaborative manner, which all the research shows, well, not all, but a lot of research shows that's the best way we learn, when we collaborate. And this is just killing that. On standardized tests, though, I couldn't find any dirt on, any of the writers of standardized tests in Australia, but I did find some dirt on the guy who invented the SATs. Hopefully everyone knows what SATs are. I think they're the entrance tests into universities in the US. And this guy, Carl Brigham, he was an army psychologist and a figurehead of the eugenics movement. Yep, this is the guy who wrote these tests. And he used data collected in the First World War to argue that American whites were the most intelligent people, And he also found evidence, or made it up, to make the case that immigrants were genetically inferior. So this is the kind of person who writes standardized tests. And you can ask anyone who knows anything about NAPLAN, those tests are biased. They are biased in favor of the rich, white people, like it's just totally biased for the people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And, you know, along this line, you know, and these tests, they determine the way that we teach, or they influence the way that we have to teach. So Linda Darling Hammond describes it like this. She says, if we taught babies to talk as most skills are taught in school, they would memorize lists of sounds in a predetermined order and practice them alone in a closet. So what can we take from all of this? It's kind of depressing, but I think it does point towards why public schools are undervalued, actually. Because actually public schools are not there to provide a quality education for working class students. They're there the real purpose is to reinforce the class divisions and prepare students for the workforce. And doing this doesn't require, you know, teachers who are well paid, respected, schools with great resources. In fact, it's the opposite that's true. Limited resourcing and overstretched teachers lend themselves to this banking model of teaching. I skipped what the banking model of teaching was. There's a session on Freire, I think on Sunday, and that'll go through that a bit more. But basically, Paulo Freire is educational theorist who wrote the book he wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he explains the banking model of teaching, where he describes it as students having empty brains and teachers just deposit knowledge into those empty brains. He says the teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher is the subject of the learning process, where the pupils are mere objects. And when you've got standardized tests determining everything, this lends itself to that. But there is a solution to all of this. That's what I want to move on to. Some of the critics of Bowles and Gintis's ideas have called them too deterministic. Their critics argue that the correspondence principle ignores the role of teachers, culture, and ideology in schools and neglects the possibility of resistance. And resistance has been happening, so that's probably a better picture than the one before. For example, one British academic, Mike Cole, you may have read some of his work, he argues that the correspondence theory can have a reactionary rather than progressive implications. He's basically arguing that it leaves radical teachers to feel that there's a lack of space for doing any good now because things are overly determined by the system. But Bowles and Gintis actually point to the contradictory nature of capitalism, which I think is actually the key in providing a solution for this problem. They write, while the system of schooling certainly functions primarily to legitimate and reproduce inequality, it sometimes produces critics, rebels, and radicals. And there's a section in the book, Schooling in Capitalist America, that elaborates on the contradictions in capitalism. You might argue that the section is too small, but you can't deny that that section is there. And the empirical evidence connecting schools and inequality is too overwhelming to deny that the economic system plays a decisive role in shaping our schools. To recognise this, together with the contradictory nature of how exactly the system plays this role, points in the direction of how to challenge this situation. When you put future workers together in schools, it's inevitable that some of the tools that are given to them will be used against the capitalist system itself. When people are taught to read, it's impossible for you to control what they will read. They're not just going to stick to the books prescribed in the curriculum. They're probably going to find some radical text as well. And if you teach them some basic computer skills, there's enormous collections of radical literature that they can find with a simple Google search. Besides, to expect that people stuck together in crowded, degrading conditions while others are living it up in heated schools which have heated swimming pools and tennis courts, not to at some point question this situation is quite an elitist misconception of what working class youth are capable of. And in some cases, we've seen students organise for equal opportunities that the system continues to promise. Just recently, there's been movements for a better public education system in the US, in Chile, in Quebec, and in Britain. I think this is a picture from those protests in Britain against the fee hikes. So what can we do as radical educators? I'm guessing, who's a teacher in this room? Yes, so probably half the room are teachers, and we're obviously left-wing teachers because we're at Marxism conference. What can we do? So I think for teachers to successfully operate outside the dominant teaching model, they need union power to back them up. Teacher unions can and should, they don't currently, but they should play a role, not just in defending wages and conditions, but also in the form and curriculum of working class education. We need to strengthen our unions, fight against standardised testing, and educate ourselves in radical pedagogy that we can implement in our classrooms. But the fight can't be just limited to the realm of education. Since schools are shaped by the economic system, then we need to target that economic system. Marxist teacher Peter McLaren says, "I see the role of teachers as that of transforming the world, not just describing or interpreting it. And education can only be emancipatory if it is connected to a struggle for social change." Marx said the weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace criticism of the weapon. Material force must be overthrown by material force. So we need education because we need that theory to be able to understand the world in which we live, how it works, who it benefits, and how it has been changed in the past. But that theory is meaningless unless we use it to transform society for the better. So I think radical teachers need to be involved in struggles outside of the classroom, but that isn't to say that in the classroom we just switch off our revolutionary ideals. Where we can, we do point out the contradictions in capitalism to our students. We listen to our students and encourage their inquiry and questioning, not shut it down. And we don't give them a hard time for being out of uniform or chewing gum. Or having headphones, which is what everyone's obsessed with. And we do try to deliver our students an education beyond the boring banking model, which only prepares them for tests. But as well, we must also take part in broader struggles, from equal marriage rights, which is something that students are actually interested in. I've invited past students to the rallies and marched with them. And we also need to be involved in helping to staff picket lines and out in industrial suburbs and any campaigns in between those. Because it's involvement in these struggles that actually lays the basis for an ultimate fight against the capitalist system itself. And I'm going to use another quote from Peter McLaren. He says, "Critical revolutionary educators seek to realise in their classrooms democratic social values and to believe in their possibilities. Consequently, we argue that they need to go outside of the protected precincts of their classrooms and analyse and explore the workings of capital there as well, to workplaces, to neighbourhoods, to urban zones, to rural communities." And I agree with that sentiment because we have a whole world to win, not just a single classroom.